Live on WFLA Now. Feel good and live your best life with Bloom Health Club. Here's Gail Guayardo.
Welcome, everyone. Today we've got a really incredibly interesting subject to talk about. It's about your past and how that impacts your relationships of today. And, it doesn't have to be something traumatic that happened. You might not even realize that something in your past is leaving you in a pattern today that maybe has you stuck. Joining us now is a longtime friend of Bloom, the syndicated show in Tampa, Florida, Dr. Carlos Garcia of Tampa Counseling and Wellness. We appreciate you joining us on our new streaming platform.
Gail, so good to be here. Thank you. It's an absolute honor to sit down and chat with you today.
Well, I know you work with so many people, and I think this new area of exploring someone's past, not something maybe traumatic or that's stand out, but something that happened that they may not realize is what has them stuck in relationships today.
Totally. I will start off with a little story that I use with a lot of folks that I talk about who don't understand this principle, right? And here's a story of a little girl who's going out to eat with her parents. And they go out to eat every Friday, Gail. And on this particular Friday, the parents say, today we're going to let you choose what you want to eat, right? So the little girl gets super excited. She's about 7 or 8 years old. Finally, I get to make some adult decisions. So they get to the restaurant. She opens the menu, sees this big, delicious, cheesy pizza and says, I want the pizza. And then mom, in a very loving mom way, honey, are you sure? Why don't you get the burger? That's what you always get. So the little girl stops and thinks about it for a minute. But she sticks to her gun. She says, no, the pizza. And then mom, you know how moms can be sometimes. Honey, what if you don't like the pizza? The burger's the safe bet. Why don't you get the burger? Now, the mom's just trying to, be protective and do what moms do. So the little girl stops and she thinks about it one more time. But she sticks to her guns. No, the pizza. And then the other parent chimes in, we're not getting the pizza. It's too big. You're not going to eat it all. It's going to be a waste of money. So the little girl says, okay, I'll have the burger. Now, in the grand scheme of things, Gail, most people wouldn't say something traumatic just transpired. But my question to you is, in that moment, what do you think that little 7-year-old believes about her ability to make decisions?
She would start second guessing herself right away.
Right away.
Then the pattern begins.
And so what we know is that parents are pretty consistent in the way that they parent over time. Now, these weren't ill-intended parents. They were just doing what most parents do. And you might say to me, okay, so maybe that 7-year-old didn't have that conscious, active adult thought. Maybe she didn't, but she experienced something. What we also know is that that probably wasn't an isolated incident. She probably heard a similar message around school, sports, piano, whatever she did, right? Now, do you imagine over time this young girl starts to experience a little bit of a challenge, maybe some self-doubt when making choices?
Absolutely.
Right? Over time, do you start to imagine that this might impact her self-esteem, her sense of confidence?
100%.
What kinds of friends do you think this child gets into? What kind of friends does she gravitate to? What kind of relationships do you think she gets into when she's a teenager and a little bit older on?
Yeah, maybe the ones that take the leadership role because she was never really taught to do that.
Absolutely. So I share this story with so many people so that they can understand that we all have things in our past, in our childhood, throughout our life experiences that impact us in a way that sometimes we're not consciously aware of. Right. And so this is the type of person that'll come and see me and say, I'm always riddled with doubt. I don't know how to make decisions. I have a lot of fear. I'm constantly anxious, but they couldn't give you a reason why. My work with people is helping them understand how their past has influenced their way of thinking, the way they navigate relationships, not only in the world, but with themselves.
I want to bring in our digital reporter and producer of Bloom Tampa Bay, Brody Waddell, who does a lot of print stories on our website about relationships. And I think that this is a newer trend, and I think it's a really healthy trend to go back and maybe not necessarily, and of course you need to look at something traumatic that happened or something that blaring, that's extremely important to unpack that. But it's also very important to look at these smaller patterns that are created in our youth, a young adulthood that really shapes relationships. You talk to a lot of experts like Dr. Garcia. Are you seeing this as a trend in mental health?
Oh, absolutely. I see this sort of stuff all the time, even in my own relationships and with my friends. I've had conversations with partners where they'll be like, oh, I'm so messed up. I'm so traumatized, this and that. And we'll talk to them and it'll be like, why? It doesn't make sense. Like, you had both of your parents. You weren't like molested or anything. You didn't go through divorce. You had no sickness. There wasn't anything like that. Like, what is, like, why are you so, having so many of these issues? And it's like interesting to hear your story like that, where it can be little tiny things like that.
Yeah.
Where they say like it adds up over time and just never dealing with it. Like, so that just fascinates me.
Yeah. And it's sort of to what you were saying, Gail. For a lot of people, it is one sort of serious episode, one traumatic event that really shifted things in their life in a big, big way. For a lot of other people, it's been a subtle underlying message that was sort of, you were conditioned to think or believe in a certain way based on your environment, based on the people in that surrounding environment that you may not be aware of.
So you talk to your clients, your patients, the people that you work with from a place of compassion, because I think we're also, a lot of people become stuck. And you talked about this on our syndicated show, Bloom, again, headquartered in Tampa, Florida. But I'm so excited that we have this extended platform to deep dive into this. You come from a place of compassion, because I think people get so stuck in blaming their past for everything that they can't move forward. I mean, I think it's important to identify with it and go back and explore it, but then it can't handicap you from moving forward. So how do you talk to people in a way they can use this knowledge to set themselves free?
Yeah, there's, one of the things that I talk about, Gail, is, up until the moment where you understand the impact of your story, you can blame yourself if you want, but you don't have all the information, right? But once you gain the insight, once you understand how your life has impacted you, then it is your responsibility to start making that change. One of the reasons that I come from such a deep place of compassion is because this was my struggle as well. I was in therapy for many years trying to overcome depression and anxiety because of how deeply rooted some of my narratives and stories were about who I was, or actually who I wasn't, right? And I struggled with my confidence and I struggled with my self-esteem. And here I was achieving all of these things in the world, yet on the inside, I felt like I was never enough and I couldn't understand why. I was like, why is it that no matter, I'd gone out, I became a United States Marine, I became a fireman, I was, going out there and getting a doctorate degree, and yet on the inside, I was like, it's not enough, it's not enough, it's not enough. And it wasn't until I went into therapy and started to figure out where that not enough narrative was coming from that I started to break free from that struggle. But the compassion comes from knowing what it felt like to sit and be that patient, to struggle through these stories that I had literally, in my world at least, become my truth. And that's why it was so hard to break with them. So the compassion comes from seeing how so many individuals come to my office over the years and have this deep sense of guilt and shame about who they are not, why they are that way. But when they learn their story and the association between what happened to you in the past and why you're navigating the world the way you are now, it's like this massive light bulb moment. It's this massive moment where they can turn to themselves and be like, oh, so it's not that I'm broken. It's not that I'm defective. It's not that there's anything wrong with me. There is actually a reason for why I think this way or feel this way.
Yeah, it's interesting. And a lot of times with Dr. Garcia on Bloom and here in the Bloom Health Club, I'll get raw and share things that have happened in my life. And I think I'm like a lot of people where, I seek therapy when there's a fire to put out, or I just don't know what else to do. So I slow down my crazy life and I sit down and I talk about it. And recently I went to a somatic therapy session. And it was interesting because we kind of dialed back to these terrible learning disabilities that I had growing up, that there was no medication for, there weren't special classes, there weren't ways to do it. And I come from a very Italian family where you got to figure it out, and survival is what we do.
Right.
And I'm so grateful for the grit that my family has given me over the years, but it was just this little memory of going back and that struggle and always trying and, trying to overcome this failure and never feeling like I was living up and I wasn't the star student that my brother was and things were so difficult for me and I was such a disappointment and all these little things that, you bury as a child because you're like, well, hey, I overcame that hurdle. Here I am today.
Right.
But it does start to hardwire some patterns that rear their head as you get older, and you don't realize it because you think, hey, I came out of this. Look, I came out of it swinging.
Yeah. And, I think sometimes it's not a conscious burying. I think sometimes in our efforts to preserve our ego, to preserve our sense of who we are, we just don't see those connections, right? And you're absolutely right, Gail. Those stories that we hear, and this is a big one for a lot of people in our culture. The story that we hear about suck it up, rub some dirt in it, and move forward, right? Mm-hmm. And this is something I have to talk to all of my clients about because they see it as something that they should wear as a badge of honor, right? This idea that whenever things get hard, I'm just going to white knuckle, I'm just going to bury everything and keep moving forward. And one of the things I share with clients is there may be instances in our life where that's very much needed, when we're really dealing with something challenging and we need to lift ourselves up. But there's so many other circumstances where that isn't helpful. And that's the story of my life, was that I was using that narrative and that way of handling things in so many of my areas, when relationships fell apart, when things didn't go my way, when I failed to meet a certain goal. And so God, the lashings that I would give myself, right? The things that I would tell myself internally about who I was when I didn't accomplish something in a timely fashion or in the way that I thought that I should have. And so, yes, we bury things sometimes consciously, but I also want to let people know sometimes it's a very unconscious process that happens just psychologically in our egos, in the service of sort of preserving, our identity and who we are.
Yeah. How do you touched a little bit on the balance of having to dig deep and find that inner grit to move forward in life, and then giving yourself a little bit of grace, because there might be people out there listening saying, if you don't rub some dirt in it, you're basically raising a snowflake.
Yeah.
So, I try to go through life with my 4 daughters, and I'm certainly not saying I've got parenting figured out. I mean, God, I wish there was a handbook for it, but I do try to go through maybe the not so much of a rub some dirt in it,
Right.
pick yourself up by your bootstraps and move on mentality that I dealt with. And grace, and finding that balance so that people know when to draw from what energy and what skills.
Absolutely. I think it's about compounding the message. I think it's both about teaching that we can be strong when we need to, but also teaching our kids that they can communicate or talk about how hard it's feeling, right? Because oftentimes what we need is to feel or have our pain, our struggle heard, have it sort of validated by somebody, especially a parent when we're early on, but by adults when we're older. So it's not that we're not going to maneuver through those hard things. It's that the message became oversimplified and overgeneralized. And oftentimes what I have people tell me, Gail, is, well, if I'm not kicking myself in the butt, then how am I ever going to get things done? What I will point out to them is, if you observe, for instance, a child learning how to walk or learning anything new in the first couple of years of life, you don't need to push them to do that, do you?
No.
There's a drive. There is something that lives within them that they're going to figure it out. And I believe we all come into the world with this drive to grow, to learn, to become better. Now, what happened was that for many of us, that drive to do better became associated with validation, right? So anytime we did really well, our parents gave us a pat on the back or a grade or an ice cream or something. And we started to feel a sense of value as a human being based on our achievements. So what happens? Why do we become lazy? Why do kids become lazy? It's not that that drive is not in them. We come into the world with that drive. Is that the message started being, only when you do well am I going to praise you. Only when you do well am I going to love you. And so we start to actually not put efforts forward to do really well, because we feel that if we don't hit that mark the way our parents are telling us to, or society is telling us to, we're going to feel shame. We're going to feel bad about ourselves. And in order to avoid that, we don't even put ourselves in the situation to take risks. But that drive lives inside all of us. That drive that little kids you see that they want to learn from the world and do. So when we remove the shame, when we remove the need to achieve because that's how we value ourselves, what people will notice and what so many of my clients will notice, there comes that natural inclination to want to do good in the world again.
I love that. Do you have any questions for Dr. Garcia about past and present?
Absolutely. So why do these things bubble to the surface in intimate relationships more so than like regular friend relationships? Is it because we're forced to deal with it? Because I think we all have those friends where you see them and it's like great to hang out with them, but you're like, God, it would be terrible to date you.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great point. Yeah. I think if we sort of understand from a psychological point the theories around attachment, right? And so attachment is those early relationships and bonds that we develop with our earliest caretakers, our mother being the first and primary one, right? I talk about like when a baby comes into the world, they are loved, right? You go and you see them and you give them hugs and kisses and they're loved unconditionally. That baby doesn't need to do anything to earn that love. But in the first handful of years, in our parents' efforts to socialize us, they start giving us a framework of how we need to be. As long as you meet mommy and daddy's or mommy and mommy's or daddy and daddy's expectations, right? You get a reward, sort of a positive reinforcement. You can feel good about yourself. You get validation, love, caring, all of that. But when you're not meeting those expectations, there's also a reinforcement. Might be a spanking, might be a timeout, might be the withdrawal of love in some ways. And that does not feel good for a child. The child, probably the most dreadful thing for any child is to lose that love and connection with a parent. It can feel very, very painful. That has a lot to do with attachment. So why does this show up in the relationships in which we have the most to lose? In those relationships where we have to be most vulnerable, in those relationships where we have to be most open, right? I talk about like our partners, our intimate partners are those people that we feel most afraid to connect with because that is the place where we can feel most afraid to lose something, to feel rejection, to feel abandonment, right? And it's an unconscious fear, but it's a fear nonetheless. So obviously, with our intimate partners, we're going to be much more careful. We're going to be, we're going to, for example, I'll have a lot of people that come in and tell me, I have this tendency to get into relationships with people that are emotionally distant or not emotionally available. And what that person may not know is that that's actually beneficial to them. Because somewhere along the lines, they experienced relationships where there was this deep tear in that attachment, and it feels deeply scary for them to be raw, vulnerable, and connect with somebody in that kind of intimate way. So that's why in our most intimate relationships, I mean, for example, I'm here talking about all of this stuff. I've become someone that's become very vulnerable as a therapist and likes to share my story. But at home with my partner, she's gotta like sometimes get the, like pry things out of me because it's just unconsciously there's this moment where it's like, oof, like if this person rejects me, oh my God, what will I do? This is the person I love most in the world.
Right. Yeah. Being vulnerable can be difficult. But I think as we age and as we go through our journey, you start to find how important it is and the importance of having that trust. I think that inner trust, which is hard for a lot of us. There are those, we're embarking on the holidays, the new year here. It makes you kind of shines a spotlight on strained relationships and people, and it leaves you wondering. Like I'm one of those people that I'm like, family is family, and you got to take the good with the bad. But there is a lot of disconnect that happens, and you see it during the holidays, whether it be in your own family or those that you love. People that just tear away from you, and you don't even know why. So, does that also come from some kind of childhood or, past pattern that they're dealing with? Because you see that. You're like, why? Why is there this discord?
Yeah, absolutely, Gail. It's hard to speak in sort of generalities when we don't know what exactly each person's story is, right? But what I have come to see is, again, I think back to a child coming into the world. They're very loving. They're giving. If you watch them in the first 5 years of their life, they want to share. Like if they see another child that falls, they go over there and they want to help. That's our natural state. That's how we come into the world, with love and compassion. Now, if at any point we lost that, if at any point we start to create barriers and distance between people, if at any point we become angry, if at any point we're constantly defensive, if at any point, that means that somewhere along the way, something transpired that put that person in a position to have to be very, very careful, to act very, very safe in order to not feel that kind of rupture or letdown of that sense of abandonment or rejection. And so, myself is a perfect example. Like I grew up in a home with a very stern father, and he was very loving, right? But he didn't know how to be a father to a young child. Much later on, we had a wonderful relationship, but so that was part of my experience. I also had a mother who was very loving and very adoring when it was convenient for her, when it meant her emotional needs were being satisfied. Now, again, not that they were dealing with their own sort of childhood traumas. My mom's dad left when she was 8 years old. There was a rupture of her own that she never sort of learned how to sort of navigate. My dad's twin brother passed away, and the story that I got from my aunt was that my grandfather came home one day and said, "We're never to talk about this ever again." Right? Like they were dealing with some really deep stuff that they didn't have the therapist or the books or the right to know how to navigate. So that was a product of the kind of environment that I had. So what happened for me was I grew up as a very sensitive child, but there was no room for those sensitive emotions in my house. It was very much that message of suck it up and keep moving forward, right? No crying, boys don't cry, all of that stuff. So what I learned unconsciously, Gail, was the adults in my life are not safe. The people in my life are not safe. I can't be vulnerable around them. So what happens in my teens and most of my 20s was I would develop intimate relationships, but there was always this little distance in between because that's what made me feel safe, right? I could also talk about ways in which I would, in my 20s, sabotage relationships because they were getting too close or too intimate. And I didn't know that I was doing this, consciously. Again, going to therapy was one of the things that helped me realize a lot of my stories, where my patterns came from, where my behaviors came from, and where a lot of my sort of programming came from as well.
I'm glad you brought up kind of like this generational hurt and generational pain, because I think it's very important to point out that, mental health just started becoming mainstream, really, quite frankly, in my humble opinion, and you can jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, either one of you, Brody, Dr. Garcia, when the pandemic hit, it was, we were all talking about it because we were all in like this like downward spiral together, and where it wasn't cool to talk about it before, we all had the commonality of what we were going through, and it became an open discussion. But, even with my older daughters that were, that are now 25 and 23, finding counseling wasn't as easy. Yeah. Insurance doesn't cover it. There was no virtual. You were having to balance work and driving through traffic and getting them out of school. Like the accessibility to heal was not there like it is today. And I know we have a long way to go, but I think we've made tremendous strides. So what I've learned as an adult, when I look back at my family, and things that I saw that I took so personally when I was young, in my teens and in my 20s, I realize now as an adult that they were really doing the best they could. Yeah. Like where I maybe was a little bit more myopic and what lens I would see people through in my family growing up, I realized that they had their own traumas. They had the own things that they were doing. And at the end of the day, they did what was best for me and my brother, I believe. And I try to do that for my children. So how do you help your clients to find that balance, to understand that
Yeah.
they might not have been dealt the best hand,
Sure.
but that's the hand. And now how do you play it in a way where you can grow and change and develop healthy relationships?
Yeah, great question, Gail. So I think that there's a process. It's a very sort of intimate and intricate process that happens in therapy. And, you know, a lot of times we develop these deep resentments or anger. I know that I had a lot of anger towards my father for how much of a disciplinarian and how aggressive he can be in his parenting sometimes. And what sort of set me free in therapy was having a therapist that allowed me to acknowledge that pain and hurt, right? That allowed me to acknowledge that that wasn't okay for that young boy, that, you know, that there should have been, you know, or could have been a different way in which that turned out. Once I was able to process through that resentment and through that anger, what came out on the other side was this deeper understanding of not only my parents, but their family, and right, like the generational stuff and how it got to that point, and what that anger ended up turning into deep compassion for the both of them. This deep love for understanding that, like you said, they were trying their absolute best with what they had, right? And I sort of reflected on myself and recognized in my life, for the most part, I'm always trying the best that I can with what I have in front of me. And that at some point later on down the road, I may be wiser and I may know more, but I can't hold my past self to that same standard. So I can't hold my parents to that standard of who they were at that time. You know, another thing to understand about my parents was at that sort of early developmental age, we had just moved here to the United States as an immigrant family, political refugees who came here from Cuba and didn't have anything. And so when I think about, like, my goodness, what would it be like to have two children, to be in my 30s with a well-established career, surrounded by family, having a great life, and to all of a sudden have to move somewhere, the fear, the uncertainty, to not know the language, to have to, like, that put quite a strain on my parents' marriage. And so I was just a product. I was growing up when all of that was transpiring. So what I try to tell my clients is, or what I try to do for my clients is give them the space so that they can have their pain heard and acknowledged and validated, right? That pain, that inner child pain. And what most often happens is once that is heard, they come out on the other side with that deeper sense of compassion that we all come into the world with.
How do you, that is beautiful. How do you bridge the divide between, because a lot of times people want to reconcile with their parents and they want to develop a relationship, like you said, with your father, where it may have started out strained, but then, you know, it evolved into something, you know, that worked for you.
Yeah.
And a lot of that, I'm sure, came from your own personal journey of finding this healing and recognizing what had happened to you and facing it. But when you come back and you reunite with that parent, you have to have almost like a common respect for one another, because one is acting defensive. Like I was just doing what I could do.
Yeah.
And the kid's like, yeah, but that really messed me up.
Right.
You know, so how were you, Dr. Carlos Garcia, able to strike that balance of finding forgiveness for what hurt you as a child and compassion and understanding for the fact that they were just going through what they were going through?
Yeah. It was a process scale of really what I call processing my anger, right? Allowing a space for it, whether it was in therapy or whether it was in talks with other people or with my dad, sort of sharing, like, this is the impact that it had on me. I know that that's not what you were trying to do, but I need you to know my truth. I need you to know what happened.
What did he say?
You know, it was really interesting because that conversation came on the brink of us just having an argument. So me and my dad, even in my older age, like, we'd have these moments, right, where I would that anger would get triggered, and I hadn't done my full healing. And so it had come on the brink of a really difficult discussion. And I remember sort of sharing with him, you know, what that was. And this wasn't this like beautiful Hallmark moment where we were sitting down with a cup of joe and processing this stuff. He was in the kitchen cooking, but what was powerful about that moment, Gail, and for anyone that knows my father, and if you knew my father, you would know what a change this was. He didn't defend himself. He didn't justify anything. He just sat and listened. And that to me was like, I've received your message and I got you. And another powerful thing was that I noticed reflecting back after some years past, after we'd had that conversation, that my dad and I's relationship really changed. And it took me a while to notice how much he had softened after that conversation, and how much love he was like intent and focused on giving me from that point forward. And, I can reflect back now. My dad's really sick. He's got dementia. But I can reflect back on that moment now and be like, he really heard me. Like, he heard my pain, and that's what I needed. And from that place, I was just able to step into this deep amount of compassion and forgiveness for his own story, for his own pain as a child, for all of the struggles he had to go through, right? And so I think the work is in, one, understanding that we all have these things inside of us that impact us, regardless of what our story is. That, two, if we're willing to be courageous and curious and look at what our story is, then we can learn so much about ourselves and the people around us and the people in the world. And what I have learned is that the more compassion I have been able to give myself, the more compassion I'm able to give other people, because I'm able to see my struggle and how hard it is. I'm able to see how hard it is to change those narratives and those ways of feeling. And so it allows me to move into this place of like, when someone's really angry at a parent, like, I get it. Let's talk about that. How do we maneuver through that? Now, there's a sort of a couple of different ways that this can pan out. Sometimes I've had clients approach their parents and all they want to do is be defensive, and I never did that. And so I prepare them to be like, that's their pain speaking. And so maybe they might not be able to, might not be ready to hear you. And that's okay. This isn't for them. This is for you. This is for your own healing. But I've also had instances where a client will go and talk to their parents and they receive like, oh my God, I never knew. And they receive all of the validation and like, I never knew that impacted you that way. I'm so sorry. I wish I could have been different. Or like, here's something that I was struggling with that we didn't let you know about. And so it can kind of go a couple of different ways. I think we have to be ready for whatever that is. But I think as long as we sort of understand that it's for our own healing, and who we can become for those people when we heal is the most powerful thing. Because through my own healing, the kind of son that I've been able to be now for my mother, for my dad, the kind of brother I can be to my sister and my brother, the kind of space of love and compassion that I can now open up to them because of my own healing, it's just so powerful, Gail. So powerful.
I think that's really beautiful. And I think that anytime you can get a snapshot in your life where you find that connectivity and you find that forgiveness and the person receives what you have to say, that's beautiful. And even though it might be just a snapshot, those feelings will last forever. Absolutely.
And, you were talking earlier about this kind of one term for it is generational trauma, right? But if we look back at our parents and our grandparents and the things that they've been through, there's a lot of challenges. And again, in that era, you didn't show emotion. You bottled everything up because that's just the way you did it, right? But we're living in different times. And there's this really beautiful quote, and it that has resonated deeply when we talk about this and doing that healing work, is that trauma runs in the family until somebody is willing to feel it, right? And I feel that not only has the work that I've done on myself, whether through therapy or otherwise, has allowed me to let go, right? To let my ancestors let go, to let my ancestors heal. But also my son now, who's 15 months, like he's going to have a different father because I took the time to heal myself, and his kids will, and their kids will. And so this work is powerful when we can do it because we really set a lot of people free, both in our past and in our present and in the future. I don't want to part ways with you until I see it from the
maybe the parent's perspective, the person out there listening right now that's saying, Dr. Garcia, I want to face the music.
Yeah.
I know I made mistakes, or if I could go back and rewrite history, I would rewrite it.
Sure.
I'm willing to accept, whatever criticisms come my way and to hear that hurt. But then sometimes parents are just left hanging. Like the child never forgives. The child never finds the healing. It's like I have a lot of mom friends, and, over the journey your relationship with your children, it'll ebb, it'll flow, it'll take turns. And as the parent that really is sitting there with arms wide open, ready to receive, it's hard when the child can't find that forgiveness.
Yeah. I would say patience, time, and consistency. If you consistently show your children that you're going to show up, and if you are patient in allowing them to maneuver through whatever they have to maneuver in their life, and trust that if you've been patient, been consistent, and been loving, they will reach that point where they're going to see. They're going to see how you showed up. But I think it's also about acknowledging your own downfalls. Like, my wife is a marriage and family therapist. I'm a therapist, right? Like, we like to think that we're going to raise an emotionally healthy child, and we may not, right? We may make more mistakes than anybody else trying to overcorrect. But sort of acknowledging that that's the case, honoring that that's the case, and sort of being a space for my child, teaching them from a very early age, that they can come and communicate that to me. And I'm not going to come to them from a place of anger or judgment, that I want to be a safe space so that when they're done doing the work that they need to do, I'm here. I'm here to listen. I'm here to acknowledge what you're going through, and hopefully kind of help you maneuver through that, right?
Beautiful. Any final questions for Dr. Garcia?
Dr. Garcia, why does on paper, some of the most impressive people attract some of the most broken people?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things we haven't talked about yet is compassion and empathy, right? And I'm a big believer, unless we've had some sort of disease of the brain or some kind of, malfunction that, most of us come into the world with a deep sense of compassion and a deep sense of empathy. Again, you can see this in children in very early ages, how they like to share and all of that. A lot of us, even though we've experienced some of these deep traumas or some of these things in our past, continue to hold on to that because we're just good people and we want to see good in the world. I'll share a little bit what happened in my own story. I was always a very sensitive child. I can really sort of relate and have a deep compassion for other people's experiences, especially hard ones. So what happened was, because there was so much marital conflict at that early developmental age, what happened for me was I started to, and this happens for a lot of children, they learn to put their own needs aside to meet the needs of other people in the home, whether it was a sibling, a parent that was an emotional need. And for a lot of us, we received reinforcement for that. What a good little boy, what a good girl. Look how you're here for mommy or daddy or whatever that was. So we started to develop a sense of value as a human being in being that for other people. So what happened for me was, in my teens, I started to find that the more broken other people were, the more issues they had, the more I felt a value in their lives. So here came Carlos to the rescue, the white knight syndrome, if anybody's heard of it. I wanted to rescue everybody from their problems, which was, ludicrous because we all have to navigate our own stuff. But that was like the extent of my relationships in my 20s and 30s, was trying to rescue people. And the more broken they were, the more of value I felt I was going to be in their lives. Now, obviously, what happens with all of that is you realize there's this other whole string of things that are challenges interpersonally for that person. And that's why the relationships never work. But it does come from this deeper place of compassion and empathy of wanting to help others.
Interesting. I could talk about this all day. It's fascinating. I think it's really wonderful that the space that you work in and help so many people in is heading in this direction. And, like Dr. Carlos Garcia said earlier when he was on Bloom, the syndicated show, maybe you don't need, week after week after week of therapy. Maybe you just need one session to find out, what's going on. It might be worth a couple $100 out of pocket, I spend it on my Botox and the things like that. Anybody out there spending it on frivolous things, you might want to maybe spend it on yourself and take a deep dive. And it could help you maybe move past things that you don't even know, you never even recognized were a problem. Could be something keeping you in a holding pattern. Yeah. Dr. Garcia, it's such a pleasure working with you. We're so lucky to have you here in Tampa Bay.
Thank you, Gail. So wonderful to be on. It's such an honor. This is my thing. This is my message, right? Getting out there and hoping that people can find that inner freedom by just getting curious about their story. It doesn't have to be about therapy. It doesn't have to be about labels. It's about more deeply understanding ourselves, because the better we can understand ourselves, the better we can understand others.
Beautiful. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.